The world is the world, with joys and sorrows and birth and death and war and peace. But what you can do is reach out and mend the place in the web of life that you can touch.
Welcome to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl, a podcast that illuminates the path to collective healing at the intersection of science and mysticism. This is the Point of Relation.
Jack Kornfield trained as a Buddhist monk in Thailand, India, and Burma. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology and is a founding teacher of the Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts and Spirit Rock Meditation Center in California. He's one of the key teachers to introduce mindfulness practice to the West and is the author of 16 books, including the recently published All in This Together.
Welcome to Point of Relation. My name is Thomas Hübl, and I'm very happy to be sitting here with Jack Kornfield. Jack, you're our guest again. I'm so happy to see you. Most welcome here.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Thomas.
It's lovely. And of course, we want to talk about your new book. But as I thought about your new book, I remembered that in my 20s, I loved to read your books, your prior books. And so I thought about something I would like to start a conversation with, because I was inspired by your writing already then. And I was wondering, your life, I would call you an elder of our society. And elderhood is something, I don't know, that got a bit lost in modern society. And I was wondering, before we turn towards your new book, how do you see like the function of elders in our society, of the principle of wisdom in our society? What's that function, if at all, if that's at all something you relate to? And then maybe we will look into your new book.
For a number of years, I kind of referred to myself as a premature elder. That was in my 50s and 60s, because I was in the role that people would turn to me as a wisdom holder or a compassion holder. And I said, that's usually the role of the elder, but here I am. And now Trudy and I, my beloved, but we both just turned 80. And we looked at each other and said, wow, we're still good. We're still, trucking and happy and doing creative things. And also, if we're going to do it, we better get to it, whatever it is. The role of elder, I think, as you point to archetypally, is the role of somebody who's seen a lot and holds it all with a much bigger perspective, that you've been through a lot and you can hold in your heart all of it, and compassion say, this is human incarnation. This is what happens. And I remember talking with my mom, and she said to me, Jackie, that's a little, my boy name. She said, I was born when my dad came back from World War I, the tanks and trenches in Europe, right? And then I lived through the Great Depression. And I remember, kids around didn't have enough to eat. Could I have a bite of your apple, please? And then, your dad went off in the Fleet Marines in World War II and didn't die. And then we had the nuclear scare, and you were hiding under your desks, right? And then there was the assassination of the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King, and huge disruption. And then, there have been all these much more recent things. And she looked and she said, this is the way of the world. And our work, or not our work, but we get to, and we we get to see that it goes in these cycles, and still there's something really strong in us that can get through it all. And in a way, I think she was giving partly the voice of an elder, and that even those things which were quite terrible in different ways do get resolved. And then I remember asking my dear friend Malidoma Somé, who is a West African shaman and medicine man with a couple of PhDs from the Sorbonne and Michigan or something, or Brandeis. I said, you just went through a huge initiation in your village, very demanding. I said, when you've passed through a great initiation, what does it prepare you for? And he laughed and he said, why, the next initiation, of course.
Right.
So the elder somehow, at best, has that perspective and then is also able to smile or love in the middle of it. And two elder stories, since you raised the subject. First, I spent a lot of time with Ram Dass, who died a few years ago, and he became more and more loving as his life went on, to the point where he said, I love everything. He look out, I love those trees. I love, everyone who comes. Um, Someone was helping move his wheelchair. He'd had a huge stroke 20 years before, and aphasia, couldn't speak well, couldn't move half of his body, had to be picked up and, brought into the bathroom. And someone asked him, are you in pain? And he looked up and he said, I love my pain, which was an amazing thing to say. And at his memorial, Krishna Das, the kind of famous kirtan singer, brother of Ram Dass from the early years, said, when Ram Dass first came back from India, wearing his white robes and beard and beads and so forth, he kind of looked like some saint or sage. And he was on stage, but he was, as Ram Dass, the public neurotic, would have confessed, was not that much so behind the scene. And then Krishna Das looked out and said, Ram Dass became the person we thought he was when we first met him. And that was the cooking of all those years of suffering, really, and all that he'd been through and serving around the world and so forth. He now had the eyes of compassion, eyes of mercy to see everybody. And a famous therapist friend of mine went to see Ram Dass toward the end of his life. And Ram Dass said, so you're doing therapy with all these people? And this guy nodded. They'd known each other since Harvard days. And Ram Dass looked at him and said, I hope you see them as already free. And that's the wisdom to say, that's who we are underneath, that there's a kind of freedom that no one can take from you. When Nelson Mandela walks out of Robben Island prison after 27 years, it's just, and changes the imagination of the world with so much magnanimity and graciousness. It's as if to say they can imprison your body, but no one can imprison your spirit. And maybe that's at best the role of an elder, to hold that space and remind people who you really are. How's that for an answer?
That's fantastic. Mesmerizing.
I was pleased with myself.
That's lovely. Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly resonate with what you're saying. I love the compassion. I love that life is more and more held in a compassionate space, because I think also many people look, especially also when we walk that spiritual journey, that we might be tempted to look for like kind of an end of it. Okay, I will practice hard, I will run it like a marathon of practice, but actually I want to get there to the finishing line, and then the world will be great, there will be no more suffering, and that's gonna be it. And I think you just gave us a bit of a remedy to that what does it mean to the next initiation and the next initiation? Like, what does it mean to live that?
And initiation is something that you pass through that's difficult, that your old being has to shed parts, and then you become somehow freer through it. So another account, for whatever reason on this podcast, my dear friend Joanna Macy died. You may have known her a few months ago, and she was a remarkable system theorist, activist all around the world for climate, for justice, in so many places, a Buddhist teacher, all these things. And she died at 96. Speaking about being an elder. And, she was a voice for what she called the great turning, that humanity is now in a time in late stage capitalism where um, either we continue to exploit and destroy the earth and fight with one another, or we find another way as of interdependence, of care for one another, and up-level our humanity and our consciousness. So I went to visit Joanna after she died. They kept her body in the house, and they made it kind of a temple, go up through the steps, all the candles, and people are chanting or singing to her and meditating, whatever. And finally, I sat next to her in the bedroom where she lay on a bed covered with flower petals. And I chanted to her and gave little Buddhist teachings on letting go into the clear light or the pure light, things like that, and reminded her of all the good things she'd done, thanked her. And then I sat quietly, and she said to me, 80, that's nothing. You got to keep going. It's 96. So there's that, which she did to the end. And then I went down into the backyard, and there were musicians playing, and there was a, barbecue, and they were having kind of a celebration of her life, and talked to two people very close to her who said Joanna loved everything. She wrote a book called World is Lover. She loved the natural world, environmentalist. We went out into the most remote places. She loved food. She loved cooking. We'd go to all these great restaurants. She loved social justice. She loved getting out there and joining those. She loved sex. So that was great for her. She loved, music. Anyway, so the next day, I was in Whole Foods and I was looking at this big chocolate thing and I thought, I shouldn't buy that. It's not good for me. And then I heard Joanna say, get the damn thing. You're 80, eat what you like. And then the day following, I had a request, could you go here? And it was sort of hard to fit in my calendar. Joanne said, you can do that, go do it. And she became kind of like a little muse as an elder saying, it's possible to stay alive, open-hearted, caring, even at 96. Go for it. So there's another story to answer your question. And I guess I'm just full of stories. What can I say?
Yeah, not only full of stories, you're full of passion. I like it. These stories are transmitting it to me. When I listen to you, I feel your aliveness and your passion, and I think that's amazing. That's so alive in you, and
Still
also in
there.
her.
Yeah.
Right. So let's let's have a look at how all of that helps us to relate to the current situation in the world, because it seems like, I mean, there are many things happening right now that for many people feel upsetting, painful, really painful, like there are wars, there are all kinds of changes in the world. So how do you look at that, and what's a path, given the wisdom that you shared of like elderhood, like how can we look at the current world together, and how do you look at the current world together? What's also the spiritual teaching in there alive for you right now?
I need to take a breath for that question, um,
Yeah.
because my eyes almost start to water, because there's immense suffering. And I think that's the first thing that we have to acknowledge. And it's not just the wars. Wars continue. Plato said only the dead know the end of war, right? So whether it's Ukraine or in South Sudan or Myanmar or whatever, and tremendous, tremendous suffering. Um, and that alone is terrible. Then, of course, we have the other things like climate disruption and, huge masses of people being fleeing from desertification and rising oceans. And then we have the kind of growing political polarization and so forth. Um, First off, it's very clear that no amount of modern invention, AI, space technology, computer technology, nanotechnology, biotechnology, all these things are going to stop continuing warfare, is going to stop continuing racism and conflict um, and climate disruption, because all these are born in the human heart. And so that the transformation that we're being called to, as Joanna Macy called the great turning, has to actually be a change in human consciousness. To the extent we're able to do that, we will suffer less and love more. And in the end, that goal of more love and more freedom is what makes life worthwhile, even if you suffer, that it somehow offers itself to something more beautiful and better. So rather than making a diagnostic, if you will, there is the Buddhist diagnostic, which says the more greed, the more hatred, the more fear, and the more ignorance equals the more suffering. The more generosity instead of greed, where we care for each other interdependently, the more love instead of hatred, where we feel connected and care, because you breathe the breath from the person next to you, and they breathe that one, and we're interbreathing with the worms and the raccoons and we can't not be connected. More love, more generosity, more wisdom, more seeing the way things are. Um, then the more happiness for humanity. And then it becomes our charge, both individually and collectively, to foster those things that do so. I've practiced with what the Buddhists call bodhisattva vows. And a bodhisattva is a archetypal description of someone who's committed themselves to compassion. Well, the Dalai Lama wakes up early in the morning at 3:30 and recites this vow from Shantideva, where he says, after meditating for some time, may I be medicine for the sick, may I be food for the hungry, may I be a resting place for the weary. May I be a lamp for those lost in the darkness. May I be a force of compassion for all beings as long as earth and sky and galaxies exist. May I do this. And over, however long it takes. It's sort of the great bodhisattva vow. Now, in Zen, when you go to a Zen monastery, you sit and you recite the four vows. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Desires are inexhaustible. I vow to master them, or something like that. There is a wee problem with that. When you go home, your family doesn't want to be saved by you, right?
That's very true.
Right? Nor do your neighbors. So it has to mean something different than that. Sometimes the better translation is I vow to free them all and free them from my expectation and my grasping and my fear. I vow, basically, the vow is turning your heart like the compass direction in the direction of compassion, and says, wherever I find myself, I will offer the quality of compassion and care for the beings I meet. So this becomes important. And in a way, your question in a deep sense is asking about samsara, the cycle of birth and death. And there are kind of better cycles for humanity and worse ones they go through. The bodhisattva, I was going to say, doesn't care, cares a lot, But notice this, oh, this is a bad cycle or a good one. The path is very clear. How long? As long as it takes. And somehow that becomes ennobling. And it doesn't mean you become this great heroic person. Actually, to fulfill it isn't mean you're going to go and change the world. The world is the world with joys and sorrows and birth and death and war and peace. But what you can do is reach out and mend the place in the web of life that you can touch. And sometimes it's big, and it's part of the society around you. And sometimes it's the smallest, tender things which can make an enormous difference. And so for me, the question really is, how do we live? And in the end, the questions are simple. Did I love well? Did I care?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Like it's what you said also releases us from the chains of place and or size, place and time.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
the wisdom is in this, like as I call this sometimes walking forever, but I heard this like that we are not anymore bound to a pressure in time, and it's not
Yes.
about if it's a big project or a small. It's like whatever is life wants you to touch. So this is beautiful. I think that releases a lot of pressure, what it should be versus what it
Yeah.
is.
Now you just have Joanna on your shoulder saying, okay, keep going.
Yeah.
What would be possible if you listened to the whisper of your soul? Join Thomas live on February 5th for an inspiring free online event and Q&A. Aligning your life with your soul, listening to your inner wisdom. Together with our global community, you'll explore how to focus your attention on what brings you freedom, strength, and joy, so you can align your life with the guidance from your soul. Visit the link in this episode's show notes to sign up for free and submit a question for Thomas. Or go to www.mysticcafeonline.com/soul. We hope to see you there.
So, all in this together is your book title. All in this together. In yes, beautiful. So, tell us a little bit what inspired you to write this? What does it mean for you all in this together? And maybe what are the consequences if we notice more and more that we are, I will call this sometimes we are the game board. It's like nobody is outside of it. Like we're all it. We're all the world. So we're all in this together. So maybe you can speak a little bit what inspired you to write it, and what did you want to convey with this new book?
Well, I gave a series of teachings on some of the great stories and some of my favorite stories because I'm in part a storyteller. And I believe that stories go into the human heart in a really direct way, especially hearing them differently than more like poetry or music, differently than learning about things. And so I collected stories that were stories of awakening, stories of love and compassion, stories of transformation. And the book is divided in that way: respect and healing and uplifting, and also stories about facing death and the end of life. There's a long story about the Buddha's last year and how he lived during that last year. Um, but they're really stories about how we can be in this world um, with a consciousness that is free and spacious, that has some humor in it, but at the same time, care. And some of them are little tiny stories, like the one of a 7-year-old boy who goes out to a restaurant with his parents for lunch, and the waitress comes by and says, what will you have? And he said, I'd like a hot dog and a Coke. And then she goes and gets the orders from the others, and the mom says, and he'll have meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and milk. And as the waitress is leaving the table, she looks back at the little boy and said, do you want ketchup or mustard on your hot dog? And he smiles and says, she thinks I'm real. And there's something in that about being honored for who you are, um, that is kind of at the core of what we learn in spiritual practice and in our care for one another, to see people with the eyes of respect and love and mercy. And the book starts with this great tale from the time of King Arthur's court about what women want. And it's very much related to that. I'll let you read to find the answer in case that interests you. But it's full of these kind of stories. Um, and what does it mean to treat each other that way? The kind of healing that comes out of it, the possibilities. Um, I'll read you a story that's in there. Um, in the early years of the Iraq War, this was in the New Yorker. A small unit of American soldiers were assigned to go to the holy city of Najaf, one of the holy places in Iraq. It was a delicate mission, and the presence of the Americans in uniform was seen by the Iraqis as a desecration of their sacred sites. When the men approached one of the most revered mosques, hundreds of Iraqis poured out of the buildings on either side, fists waving, throats taut. They pressed in on the 15 Americans who glanced at each other in terror. The reporting witnessing said he's afraid a shot would come from somewhere, someone would open fire, it would turn into a massacre. Then, quite suddenly, in the middle of it all, the American officer stopped, held his rifle high over his head, with the barrel pointed to the ground. He stood there against the backdrop of this seething crowd, now almost 1,000 deep. It was a striking gesture, almost biblical, and then he took a knee. The officer, eyes behind the sunglasses, held his position and told his men to follow. The soldiers looked at him as if he were crazy, and then one after another, swaying in bulky body armor and gear, they knelt before the boiling crowd, pointed their guns at the ground in the same position as the officer. The Iraqis fell silent, their anger subsided, and the officer ordered his men to withdraw. The writer of the story said it took him some months to track down Lieutenant Colonel Chris Hughes and ask him, how did you learn to tame a crowd in a war zone in this distant country? And he assured me, he went on, that it wasn't found in the Army manual. The problem with warning shots is the next thing you know, people start shooting for real. The real issue was the Iraqis felt disrespected by our presence. And what I could offer them was a gesture of respect. And so that's kind of a sample of, the hundreds of stories in this book about death, about conflict in families. There's a whole huge story of the great Indian story from the Upanishads of Nachiketa, who has a fight with his father and then goes down to see the Lord of Death. There are beautiful stories of all kinds. And it's basically from the beginning just to remind people and remind our heart of the greatness of.
And it's also beautiful to see how it touches you, like how the story touches you, and also how this the power of respect is really can change moments. And I want to ask you something, because in this moment there is a certain choice that happened. Like these moments often go other ways. And in this moment, something happened that changes the course of what maybe most people expect to happen. And maybe you can speak a little bit to that moment when, maybe in our own life also, the trajectory of our own life goes in certain direction, and suddenly there's a moment that is different, or that allows for something new, or allows for like a different thing to happen, a different thing to be said, whatever, a different response. And this changes something. And there are maybe great example. You talk about Nelson Mandela, for example, before, or Martin Luther King. But you maybe we talk about this in everybody's lives. There might be smaller moments of that in that change the course of something in our life. Because for me, it's touching to see that the trajectory of life, when it goes like what you just said, it could have gone very differently, and then somehow the mindfulness or the greatness of one person or a group of people allows for a new possibility. And I love this space that allows for it. So that's why I'm curious how you look at this.
Well, I love the fact that your own work, and maybe we'll get to your new book with Dick Schwartz, that your own work is both individual and collective, that we carry kind of collective intention as well as the kind of healing work that individuals can do. And I can feel in your question um, that it's something alive in your life. Like, how do I do this? And, I was teasing you before uh, we started because there you've been doing also some collective trauma work between the German-speaking countries, Germany and Austria, and Israel after the Jewish Holocaust and things like that. And you're married to an Israeli. I said, you're just trying to work your marriage out in this, in this. Anyway, so it's a really important question. And the reason I'm teasing you also is that it's also very personal. It's not just, as you say, it's not just the global Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. So, a couple things. One of the most beautiful practices that you learn in practicing mindfulness or paying attention is to notice the quality of intention. Um, and this is paired with taking a mindful pause, a sacred pause. When you're in the middle of not knowing what to do in confusion or conflict with somebody or something that's difficult, can you pause? Not can you, you can pause. Let's put it more positive. You can actually pause. And then when you pause, if you take 30 seconds, a minute, whatever, and get quiet, you can ask yourself, what's my best intention? What's, the most, the highest intention? And this goes down, you said, like down to the nitty gritty, to the little things. There you are in conflict with the person you live with. I mean, I live with my beloved Trudy Goodman, and we would never get in conflict because we're Dharma teachers, right? But just in case it could happen,
Exactly.
just in case, if I pause uh, and I ask, what's my best intention? In the conflict, usually it's to show that I'm right, to prove a point, to go some direction. I'm full of myself, and she may be full of herself, and she may have acted badly. I may have, who knows? But when I pause and ask, what's my best intention? What's my highest intention? It's always to love. It's always, or it's, out in the marketplace and I'm struggling with something and I pause. It's to have a respectful connection. It's not to hate somebody. And all of a sudden, my tone of voice changes, my posture changes. I'm not in the, defending being right. Um, so the quality of mindful attention and that kind of listening to yourself, it's not far away, and you don't have to go and practice in a, Tibetan monastery or Indian ashram. A couple of breaths and a minute of getting quiet and asking, and that alone can change the course of where you are.
I love that. That's really beautiful. So it's space and intention, right? And uh, the freedom to ask that question in that moment. What do you think is the reason that many times it seems like we don't have that space? What is that built on?
Well, the first thing I was going to say is fear. And I'm thinking about that because I just used a personal example. But if we look at the current political climate and global climate, um, there's a lot of the stoking of fear and the kind of raising it up. And one of H.L. Mencken, one of the greatest political commentators in the early part of the last century, said the whole aim of politics is to galvanize the populace with fear. And then you can run the country or whatever it is you want to do. And that's what's happening in some way. So it's both collective and it is individual. And the fear, which is there deep seated in us as an organism, is there a tiger or is the tribe near us that is aggressive going to come and take all our food or whatever, um, or um, the kind of fears that are self-protective. They're one part of who we are. We have this animal body and it's encoded in us. But it's not who we really are. We rent the body. We're in here. We are actually consciousness, you know, and we get to steer it and use it. And then at the end, we kind of turn it in like we rented Hertz, a car. And okay, let's see what happens next. We could talk about what happens when you die if you want. Um, but the sense of separateness is right there. And of course, next to it is the sense of love. And that's incredibly powerful. Um, and so somehow I want to weave it together with Gary Snyder, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning poet and environmentalist who wrote Earth Household 50 years ago, talking about bioregionalism and climate before it was even on the public radar. And a friend of mine, Wes Nisker, went to visit Gary. He's in his 90s, speaking of elders, and said, Gary, the oceans are rising and populations are being displaced by floods and tornadoes and deserts and, not to speak of continuing war. And Gary, the animals, the species are being decimated. What advice do you have? You've been doing this for 50 years. And he looked back. He's also a Zen teacher. And he said, don't feel guilty. Don't feel guilty. If you want to save it, don't save it out of guilt or fear or anger. The only force that is strong enough to save it is your love. It's what allows mothers to pick cars up off their children. It's the it's that force where we feel connected that can change everything. And so he was pointing to this human possibility for us. I forget what your original question was, but I don't care really because we're
No, but
following a stream and
is
meandering in some fashion. Um, but it's something about the state of the world. The world is the world, and why is it? Well, there's the fear, but the opposite of fear is love, is the
mm,
connection. And you do trauma work a lot. And I have a question or two for you, but I'll tell another story first. I was working with Luis Rodriguez, who's a great Latin poet. He was the poet laureate of Los Angeles and an activist and um, author of La Vida Loca, My Gang Days in LA, which he says proudly is the most stolen book out of high school libraries across America. And with Michael Meade, the great mythologist, kind of heir to Joseph Campbell, and also a wonderful teacher. And we were doing a retreat, a gathering for young men coming out of street gangs where there'd been a lot of violence. Um, the undeclared war on the streets with young people shooting at one another. And so we're sitting in this place. These young men had come, and Michael welcomed them and so forth. And one of them kind of spoke up, one of the more forward ones, and said, listen, you guys, Michael started with a poem, a little, or Louis did. You're going to give us some effing meditations and poems. We're out on the street. People got 9mm guns. You got to give us something better than that. And then we said, well, help us. Lit a candle and put it on a table and said, would you go out in the parking lot and bring a stone in for every young person you know who's been killed and say their name when you place it by the candle? And some of these kids came in with their hands full of stones. No young person should know that many dead people. This is for Tito, and this is for RJ, this is for Homegirl, and this is for, And as soon as that was done, the hoods that were up and the Snickers and whatever, they just disappeared. It's like, okay, now we're going to get down to it. We're actually going to talk about what we're carrying in our hearts that no one ever asks us about. And there's some way, it doesn't take a lot. This is a gesture of both respect and caring. And you know it because you do the collective work of healing trauma as well as the individual work.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. First of all, that's a beautiful start of such a gathering. That was a beautiful move. How to engage people. This was beautiful. Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of collective pain, and I think if we can relate to it in different ways and create spaces as you did, so I think that's a very powerful transmutation or growth
Yes.
possibility. Yeah.
Yes, because it's bringing into consciousness together.
Mm.
And a lot of it is shared pain. It's not just individual. And I know when I work with individuals and they'll come and, this terrible thing happened and they feel like maybe it's a woman whose child has died, and we do all kinds of deep healing work and compassion, so forth. And then at some point, I also, at the right time and not bypassing her grief, say, let us connect with all the mothers who've lost children. And all of a sudden, it's not just her pain, it's the pain. It's the pain of the mothers who carry the pain of the world in their heart, and hold it up in spite of that. And so there's something collective. So one of the things I found in reading your new book, Shifting, with Dick Schwartz, and I read it also avidly because you had a whole series of vignettes where you had yourself or Dick, and then the participant or the client or whatever you call that person who's struggling with their trauma or their pain. We'll talk about trauma in a minute, um, and how you guided them to pay attention to it, to listen to it in different ways, to listen to different parts of it. And already you created a kind of shared field of compassion so they could do that. And that alone is tremendously healing. One of the things that struck me as I read it is we're doing the same thing. I work with individuals, and people will in a group I'm working with, even if it's people I don't know, it's not like a close group, and will ask me about something as an elder, whatever. And my first response is, "What makes you ask?" Because they might say, "Tell me about karma," and I could go on for an hour about all the different as. But I say, "What makes you ask?" And they say, my nephew was killed in a car accident this week, or my brother won the lottery, right? Or some other thing. And then the answer would be entirely different depending on what's happened. So it also has to be engaged person to person. First thing is, what makes you ask? Then, all right, how do you feel that in your body? Because you're carrying it. Where do you carry it? How do you touch it? You're trying to get over it. You want it not to be there. What happens if you bring in compassion and just hold the suffering? We'll hold it with you together. You know, then what story does it tell? Okay, is that story always true? Kind of what is it like? Suppose you step back and become the witness to that drama or that story. How else could it be told? What does that mean? And then a series of other questions like that. And sometimes it's the individual, and sometimes it's crowdsource. That person will say, "Oh my God, I'm in the middle of this divorce, and he did this, and it was so shitty, and he did." And then, okay, I'm holding it. I've got compassion. Um, I said, I might say first, have you considered revenge? And then they break out in laughter because we all have, right? And I say, all right, you considered that. Now what? Now what is the wisest part of you want to do with it? Right? How do you tend the broken heart? And then I'll go on and I'll say, who else in this group has learned from the agony of divorce or someone acting? And all of a sudden, seven people speak up and they all have the heart and the compassion. They love this person because they're in it with, and they have the wisdom to say, this is what I learned. And so
Mm.
when I look at what you and Dick and it's um it's just attending
Sounds
to the
right.
heart. Does
Exactly.
that
Sounds
ring true? Am I on the same page
totally,
with you?
totally. And
Yeah.
also beautifully framed. And I like also this crowdsourcing, like the resonance. I find it super powerful when somebody brings something into the group. We work a bit, and then I ask, okay, who else? And I don't know, many hands go up, and then you feel this the synchronization of that, and then you feel that it's not just this personal shortcoming, but that we are sitting like all in it together. I have that experience so many times in so many groups. Like the title of your book is like this, that you see we share different patterns and different fields and they work through us. And I also love, and I want to ask you because I somehow feel that what you just described, that there's a group of people and one-on-one work within a group of people, I find it always that this is much more powerful. This, instead of sitting one-on-one in different separate practices, I find this group. So I'm wondering if there is not the next step also in developing more of this kind of collective healing spaces where one-on-one work happens, but it happens much more crowdfunded, as you said, with the consciousness of so many people supports everybody in the community, and I'm sure you see this all the time too.
Yeah. Well, of course, in the field of psychotherapy, there's been a great deal of attention to one-on-one individual, but there's also been lots of group therapy. Let's go back to Virginia Satir and family therapy and things like that.
Mm.
One of the most remarkable things, family therapy 50 years ago, they'd bring in some kid who was acting out and, in terrible ways and, cutting themselves and, breaking things and so forth. And all right, we need to help this kid. And then Virginia would say, well, what is the milieu? What is happening around this kid? And insist on bringing the parents in. And when the parents were there, you would see the horrific fights that the parents were having and their conflict. And then the child was called the identified patient, was the name. That is to say, the child seemed like the bad one, but actually they were acting out the pain of the family because the
Mm.
parents couldn't do it consciously. So we've
Mm.
had this as well. We haven't had it so much collectively between societies, but I think in some places in indigenous societies, they knew
Yeah.
about this. If you read, there's a beautiful book, might have been Richard Katz, called Boiling Energy 50 years ago, Harvard Press, about the Kung Bush people in Africa. And when they're upset, the community comes together and dances it in this intense way. And they let the energy get displayed. And then everybody goes, okay, we have this. We also have a container for it. And that's also some of the kind of the work that you're doing. Um, and yes, we've forgotten that. And we have rituals, but sometimes they're empty rituals that we
Mm.
do in some way. The real ones, like the stones in the candle,
Hmm.
um, bring people together in a very, very different way. I read you a
Hmm.
poem
That's beautiful. Please.
called Everyday Grace by Stella Nasanovich. It can happen like that, meeting at the auto repair, buying tires amid the smell of rubber, the grating sound of jackhammers and drills. Anywhere we share stories, grace flows between us. The tire center waiting room becomes a healing place as one speaks of her husband's heart valve replacement, bed sores from complications. A man speaks of multiple surgeries, notes his false appearance as strong and healthy. I share my sister's death from breast cancer, her youngest only 7. A woman rises, gives her name, Mrs. Henry, then takes my hand, and suddenly an ordinary day becomes holy ground. So here's something to say, and I'm curious to get your response. When I trained as a psychologist, starting 50 years ago at least, um, trauma wasn't mentioned much.
Mm.
Not only not about collective trauma very much, but even individual. The word wasn't used a lot. And yeah, there was talking about, people's problems and suffering, but it wasn't on the radar and it wasn't understood how we can carry trauma and how it affects our lives and one another. Now the pendulum has swung and it's like trauma central, trauma. Everybody's got traumatized. We need to give trauma warnings. We're talking about everybody's trauma. And it's like, give me a break. I remember being in the forest monastery with my teacher, Ajahn Chah. Now talk about a wise elder. And people would come and they had everything. There was a soldier who lost his closest buddy and was weeping. And there is a man, a rice farmer whose barn burned down, or someone whose kid, had an accident or someone coming because they had mental disturbance. And he called it all suffering. It wasn't, it's the Buddhist First Noble Truth. We have suffering, right? And then he had medicine. For you, you can't even sit still, work in the kitchen, do walking meditation, serve in a group. And for you, here's a practice of compassion for yourself and others like you. Then for another, here, just sit with me, sit around me, and feel in the company of people can help regulate you. He had all kinds of beautiful practices. The first noble truth of the Buddha is there's suffering. It's not trauma, it's being alive. So I'm just talking about that swing, and it's like, come on already. It's the suffering. Why the whole like trauma industry?
Yeah, I think you said it. I mean, first of all, I completely agree with you that the pendulum went to the other side of the extreme. You said it. And but when I listen to you with your teacher and the examples that you mentioned, I think however we call it, that we intuitively or in an attuned way find the kind of right practice for that specific person. That's the art for me. Not however we call whatever is the internal process, but if we get that, if we can see or feel or intuit whatever is going on and find a remedy that fits, that I think is the art, not if it's called trauma or not. I mean, I think there's a great revelation also in understanding trauma better, and also to understand how that is individually and intergenerationally viable and collectively. But I think what you just mentioned is like this intuitive wisdom or this deep seeing that we can feel what a person needs in order to grow or to deepen or to the remedies for this person. And that I think is the fascinating quality that we are looking for, this wisdom.
So let me add 2 things to that. First of all, I have immense respect for you and for Peter Levine and Bessel and various other of the leaders who brought us, Francine, who brought us the skills to turn toward that suffering and help people release it individually or collectively. So I love that, and I'm really grateful for it. The problem that One of the problems that we're talking about, I will put in a different language, is that people get identified with their trauma and the healers. And the healers identify these people as a trauma person, you know, and then, oh, I'm traumatized and will I ever get over, or that traumatized me. Somebody said something and now I'm totally traumatized. And that doesn't help. Sometimes it's even nutty. You need the trauma warning because we're going to talk about suffering. Well, suffering is here. And so part of also the work of kind of bringing the pendulum back to the middle is to see that you're not your trauma. And my understanding, you can tell me if I'm right about this, is that traumatic memory, which is in our bodies and so forth, also is encoded and memory itself in different parts of the brain. And that part of the brain carries a memory connected. Of course, we're not just our brain, we're consciousness, but the brain kind of mediates it, is memory. And you can have a terrible memory of things or a very beautiful memory. The trauma memories are in a different part of the brain. And the thing that characterizes them, it's as if it's happening now, right? If you're on the street and a car backfires and you're a vet, and you're still kind of in your trauma, it's like you're being shot at. It wasn't back there in the war zone, it's now, or other kind of traumas that you were. And part of the trauma work isn't to erase the memory, but to move it from where it feels like the body's on alarm all the time to a place where I remember that, I learned from it, it was terrible, but that's not who I am. I'm somewhat bigger. Okay, does that fit your understanding?
Totally, totally. And I also want to highlight what you said, that I see often also in our groups that how it's being pushed to the other extreme, that it becomes like this canceling culture and it becomes like nothing can be said anymore and everything is just harm and everything is re-traumatization, and it really needs a correction of this extreme part. And I'm 100% with you on that. How we increase love, compassion, and care, or sensitivity and attunement, that's, I think, important. How we care for each other, that can grow. Yeah, and the other part too, of course, how can we get to this place that our presence can embrace this and we are not identified with those parts, for sure.
Yeah, you don't take it. And so first, it's not who you are. And then a second interesting question is, how did you benefit from this? What have you learned? And that's a horrible question to ask somebody who's completely lost or completely trauma identified. But at MIT, there's a professor, Francis Lamb, who's doing all kinds of future projects, the MIT Media Lab. And one of them starts with agriculture of the future. And they're looking at different kind of plants and what can be done to foster plants that can really feed humanity in new ways and so forth. And one of the students, um, influenced by my generation of hippies, probably said, how about if we play music for our plants? Could we play Mozart? Let's see. And Professor Lamb said, well, we're scientists. Let's see uh, what happens. He said, let's do it this way. And they created an experiment. One bed in one greenhouse was just normal plants. One was the same plants, but had Mozart, and one had hip hop, had Tupac. Okay. So they planted, and then some weeks later, they measured the plants. And do you know which plants did the best? Tupac. And the reason was that the beat from that music shook them, and they had to grow stronger roots to kind of withstand that intensity, and they became the most robust plants. So
Yeah.
this is a question that one also needs to dare ask. Like, what have you learned from this? How have you grown from
Of course.
this as
Of
well,
course.
if you dare?
Of course. And that speaks also to the deeper intelligence that learn to live with it, work with it, and also heal it. That's the same, that's the intelligence that helps us to heal. Is the
What is
intelligence.
super intelligent? I know we have to end. What is super intelligence?
No, I'm saying that's the when you ask that question, you also
Yeah.
ask the deeper intelligence of the person. How
Yes.
did you deal with that hardship?
Yes.
And that
Their
is
in
also
their
part of
wisdom.
the
Yes.
remedy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jack, this is amazing. I would love to continue this conversation. I have another one because it's so lovely. Like it's fantastic. I think we need to finish for today, but I would be very happy to at a certain time have another conversation. It's really rich, and thank you for all the questions you bring in and all the inspirations, and especially also like the stories and how deeply it touches you is very touching. I can feel your love and care through that. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Thomas. I feel like we are kindred spirits,
Mm. Yeah,
and
I feel
that
that
it,
too.
yeah, right. Getting in trouble together. So I will see you at Oxford then, I think, too, which will be that's a ways away, but that will be a pleasure. Yeah. And thank you for hosting me too.
It's a pleasure. It's my honor. So thank you
Yeah.
for
All
doing
right.
everything. Thank you.
Speaking as an elder to a premature elder, what can I say?
Right. Yeah, I love your
Take care.
humor and take care. Be blessed, Jack.
You too.
Thanks for listening to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl. Stay connected and get updates about new episodes by visiting our website, pointofrelationpodcast.com, and by subscribing to the Thomas Hübl YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share about us with your community on social media. Thank you. We appreciate your support.